It was a cold and foggy evening when Priya boarded the last train from a secluded hill station back to her hometown. The train, unusually empty, creaked with age as she stepped inside. The warm interior lighting cast long shadows on the walls, the soft hum of the engine the only comfort against the eerie quiet. Priya glanced at her ticket, Coach D, Seat 21. She walked past empty compartments, her footsteps echoing unnervingly. At her seat, she found an old woman staring blankly out of the window. "Excuse me, I think this is my seat," Priya said politely. The woman slowly turned her head, her eyes unusually bright in the dim light. Without a word, she slid into the opposite seat, gesturing for Priya to sit down. "Thank you," Priya murmured, sitting down with a small smile. But the woman's unsettling silence and the faint chill around her made Priya uneasy. As the train lurched forward, Priya noticed the thick fog outside, obscuring any view of the landscape. The ride started smoothly, with only the rhythmic clattering of wheels on rails breaking the silence. About 20 minutes in, Priya saw something odd. Outside her window, faint shapes seemed to move along the tracks, blurred, indistinct forms that melted into the fog when she tried to focus on them. She shook her head, blaming exhaustion. "Long journeys make the mind wander," the old woman muttered suddenly, her raspy voice startling Priya. Yes, I suppose," Priya replied, forcing a chuckle. But her unease grew as the woman continued to stare, her lips curling into a faint, unnatural smile. An hour passed. Priya noticed that the train hadn't stopped at a single station. Peering out the window, she couldn't see anything resembling a town or even lights in the distance. Just endless fog and fleeting shadows. Finally, she stood and walked down the corridor to find the conductor. But the further she went, the stranger things became. The once-lit carriages now flickered with dim light, and the few other passengers she encountered seemed off. A man in a tattered suit sat stiffly, clutching a newspaper that appeared decades old. Across from him, a child held a doll with empty, cracked eyes, rocking back and forth but never blinking. "Excuse me, is everything all right?" Priya ventured, her voice trembling. No response. Not even a glance in her direction. It was as if they weren't really there. Priya hurried to the front of the train, her breathing shallow. When she finally found the conductor's compartment, the door creaked open to reveal no one. The train was running on its own. Panic rose as she stumbled back toward her seat. That's when the lights dimmed, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. And then she heard it, a low whispering, growing louder with each step. She stopped, her ears straining to make sense of the words. It was a chorus of voices, some pleading, some mocking, all tangled together. "Turn back, you shouldn't have come, no way out." Reaching her coach, Priya froze. The old woman was gone. In her place was a newspaper lying on the seat, yellowed and brittle. On its front page was a haunting headline. "Train derails, all passengers feared dead." The date was from 40 years ago. She staggered back, her heart racing, and slammed into someone. Turning, she found herself face to face with the same old woman, now staring at her with hollow eyes. "You're part of the journey now," the woman rasped, her lips unmoving as the words echoed in Priya's mind. The train shuddered violently. Priya grabbed onto a pole as the windows darkened, the fog outside replaced by a vast, inky blackness. Passengers began to emerge from their seats, their faces grotesquely twisted and shadowed. They moved slowly, shuffling toward her, their eyes filled with malice. "No!" Priya screamed, bolting toward the emergency brake. But when she pulled it, the train didn't stop. Instead, the walls of the carriage began to twist and warp, the floor beneath her shifting like quicksand. Through the growing chaos, a figure appeared at the end of the corridor, the train's conductor, his face half-rotten, his uniform soaked in blood. "Tickets, please," he growled, holding out a skeletal hand. "I just want to leave," Priya cried, backing away. "You're on the ghost train now," the conductor hissed. There's no destination, only the journey. The train plunged into darkness, and Priya felt herself falling. She woke up hours later, sprawled on the cold tracks. The train was gone, the fog dissipated. As she stood, shaking, she saw lights in the distance, a station, bustling with life. But when she reached for her phone to call for help, she froze. The screen reflected her face. And behind her, the faint silhouette of a train speeding away, its windows filled with hollow, watching eyes. It was the dead of winter when Avi found himself stranded at an unfamiliar railway station. His car had broken down on a lonely stretch of road, and with no signal to call for help, he'd walked 3 miles in the biting cold before stumbling upon the station. The sign overhead was nearly obscured by layers of peeling paint and ivy, but he could just make out the words, Ravens Reach Junction. There was no one in sight except for an old ticket seller dozing behind the counter. Next train to the city? Avi asked, his voice echoing unnaturally in the empty space. The man stirred slightly, his milky eyes meeting Avi's. Midnight, he croaked, sliding a yellowed ticket under the glass. Avi frowned. Midnight was over an hour away. He slumped onto a bench, rubbing his hands together to stay warm. The icy silence of the station wrapped around him like a shroud, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. Finally, the train arrived. It seemed to materialize out of the dark, the headlights cutting through the fog. The locomotive was massive and ancient, its exterior covered in frost and rusted metal. When it screeched to a halt, a blast of icy wind almost knocked Avi over. The doors hissed open, revealing an eerily empty interior. City, right? He muttered to himself, stepping aboard. The train was cold inside, colder than the night outside. He found a seat near a window, noticing the curious lack of passengers. As the train pulled out of the station, he wrapped his arms around himself, suddenly regretting his decision to board. Minutes turned into hours. The train moved endlessly through a featureless landscape. At first, Avi blamed the darkness, but soon he realized something was wrong. The train wasn't stopping at any stations. "Excuse me," he called, wandering into the next compartment. There were a few people seated here, but none seemed right. A man stared straight ahead, unblinking, clutching a briefcase tightly to his chest. A woman in a torn shawl hummed softly to herself, her lips barely moving. None of them reacted as Avi passed. "Conductor!" Avi shouted, his voice faltering. He kept moving until he found the conductor, an older man in a pristine uniform, sitting in the next car. "Hey, when is the next stop?" Avi asked. The conductor turned slowly, his face pale and expressionless. "No stops," he replied. His voice was hollow, as though coming from a great distance. "What? No stops?" Avi repeated, a cold sweat breaking over him. "How do I get off?" The conductor fixed him with an icy stare. "You don't." Avi stumbled back to his seat, panic bubbling in his chest. Outside the window, the scenery had changed, or rather, it had disappeared entirely. The train seemed to be moving through a void, an endless expanse of darkness. He tried his phone again, but there was still no signal. Frustrated, he turned to the nearest passenger, the man with the briefcase. "Hey, do you know what's going on?" he asked. The man turned, his face pale as wax, his eyes dark pits. "Not going on," the man whispered. "Going back." Avi recoiled, his heart hammering. What does that mean?" But the man said nothing else, his expression frozen in anguish. The hum of the train grew louder, almost deafening, as it began to shudder violently. Avi realized he could hear faint whispers coming from the walls, an endless stream of voices overlapping one another. He tried to block them out, but they only grew louder. "Stop the train," he shouted, racing toward the front car. The compartments seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning as he ran. Passengers turned to watch him, each face unnatural and wrong. At last, he burst into the engine room, where he froze. The conductor wasn't human. Its form was skeletal, covered in tattered flesh, its empty eyes locked on Avi. When it spoke, the voice was layered, as though 1,000 souls screamed in unison. "You boarded the Midnight Express," it said. "A one-way ticket for the lost. A journey back to what you ran from." "I'm not lost," Avi protested, his voice breaking. "I just needed to get to the city." The conductor's twisted smile widened. "Everyone here thought they knew their destination. But all roads lead to their sins." The train shuddered harder, the walls buckling as Avi stumbled backward. Memories flashed before his eyes, the lies he told, the friendships he ruined, the one person he'd wronged most. He'd always run, blaming the world for his misfortune. But deep down, he knew the truth. "You don't belong here," the conductor hissed. "You belong there." With a screech of brakes, the train halted abruptly, and Avi was thrown against the door. He looked outside. It wasn't the city. It was a barren wasteland, its air heavy with despair. At its center stood a decrepit house he recognized instantly. It was his childhood home, a place he had vowed never to return to. "No," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. The conductor loomed over him, its bony hand pointing. "Disembark." Avi tried to resist, but the air pulled him out, dragging him toward the house. The train vanished behind him, leaving only the chilling echoes of laughter. The Midnight Express continued on, its destination unknowable, its passengers trapped in an endless loop of their own horrors. Somewhere, in another dark corner of the world, it would find its next traveler, another lost soul seeking an escape from their own shadow. Arjun boarded the train late at night, desperate to leave behind the suffocating memories of the city. He had just buried his mother, and the emptiness in his chest was too much to bear. When he saw the rusted train idling at the station, he didn't care where it was heading, he just wanted to go anywhere but here. The train's sign read Final Destination, Iron Hollow. The name was unfamiliar, but Arjun didn't question it. He clutched his ticket, a strange piece of red parchment handed to him by the shadowy figure manning the booth, and took a seat in the last compartment. Inside, the train was cold and dimly lit, the overhead lamps flickering as if struggling to stay awake. The only other passengers were scattered along the rows, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats or hooded jackets. Arjun sat by a window and stared into the inky darkness outside, trying not to dwell on the oddities around him. As the train began its journey, the atmosphere grew heavier. Time seemed to warp. Arjun checked his phone, but the clock blinked erratically. When he glanced out the window, there were no stars, no lights, just endless black. It was the old man sitting across the aisle who broke the silence first. His face was gaunt, his sunken eyes almost glowing in the dim light. "First trip on the hollow line?" the man asked, his voice raspy. "Yeah," Arjun replied hesitantly. "I've never even heard of it before." "Few have," the man said with a twisted grin. "But it always finds those it's meant to." "What do you mean?" Arjun asked, unease settling in his chest. The man chuckled, low and humorless. "You'll see." An hour passed. Then another. Yet the train made no stops. Arjun's nervous glances at the other passengers revealed something chilling. They weren't just quiet, they were motionless. The woman with the braided hair hadn't shifted in her seat. The man by the window hadn't blinked. Their skin was pale, almost translucent. Arjun decided to move to another car. He grabbed his bag, intending to put distance between himself and the unnerving stillness around him. But when he opened the door to the next compartment, his breath hitched. The passengers here were the same. No, they were identical. Another braided woman sat stiffly in her seat, her head tilted at the same unnatural angle. Another silent man stared blankly out of the window, unblinking. Arjun stumbled back into his car, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. The train jolted suddenly, throwing Arjun against the seat. The lights dimmed even further, casting the compartment in eerie shadow. From the far end of the car, a figure emerged, a woman in a tattered dress, her head lolling to one side as if her neck couldn't support it. She walked unsteadily, her bare feet scraping against the floor. When she lifted her face, Arjun felt the blood drain from his own. Her eyes were hollow sockets, and her lips stretched into an impossibly wide smile. "Why are you running, Arjun?" she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. I'm not," he stammered, backing into the corner of his seat. "Oh, but you are," she crooned, stepping closer. "Running from grief. Running from guilt." Her skeletal hand reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek. Her touch was icy, a numbing cold that seeped into his skin. "You didn't save her," she hissed. "You were too late." Arjun squeezed his eyes shut, clutching his mother's scarf still in his jacket pocket. His mind reeled with images, his mother's frail figure in her hospital bed, the machines beeping erratically, the doctor's words, "You can still make it if you hurry." But he hadn't. He'd been too slow. Too cowardly. "I didn't mean to fail her," he choked, tears streaming down his face. When he opened his eyes, the woman was gone. But the train wasn't. It was speeding up, the hum of its engine growing into a deafening roar. The world outside the window was no longer black, it was a twisted landscape of fragmented memories, his childhood home, the hospital, his mother's funeral. The train was dragging him through his worst moments, forcing him to confront every failure and regret. Desperate, Arjun ran toward the conductor's car, the walls of the train warping and pulsating around him. Faces emerged from the darkness, whispering his name, accusing him. When he finally reached the front, the conductor turned to face him. It wasn't human. The creature's form was grotesque, an amalgamation of writhing shadows and clawed limbs. Its face constantly shifted, taking the form of those Arjun had lost, his mother, his father, friends he'd let down. "Where are you taking me?" Arjun demanded, his voice shaking. The conductor grinned, its mouth stretching impossibly wide. "Home." The train screeched to a halt. Arjun was thrown to the floor, and when he looked up, the door opened to reveal a landscape of ash and ruin. At the center stood his mother's house, decayed and crumbling. The front door hung open, the darkness within beckoning him. "No," Arjun whispered. "I can't." The conductor loomed over him. "This is your stop. All tickets lead back to the choices you fear the most." Arjun was pulled from the train, his screams swallowed by the void. When the midnight train departed, it left nothing behind, not even footprints in the ash. Somewhere far away, it stopped at another station, waiting for its next passenger, its next confession. For some journeys, the ticket is punched the moment the guilt begins. Vandana was never one for long train rides, but a job interview in a distant city left her no choice. The journey would take her overnight, and she booked herself into the sleeper car. The train, named the Nightfall Express, was old and oddly quiet when she boarded. The faint creaking of its metal frame was the only sound as she settled into her berth. Her compartment had 6 seats, but only 2 others were occupied. An elderly man sat in a corner, reading a yellowed newspaper, and across from her was a young woman who stared blankly at the window, her hands folded in her lap. As the train began its slow crawl through the countryside, Vandana made small talk with the young woman. But the girl barely responded, only offering a tight-lipped smile and a nod before returning her gaze to the window. The older man never looked up from his paper. It was past midnight when Vandana woke up abruptly, the train shaking as though it had hit uneven tracks. She glanced around and noticed that the older man and the young woman were gone. Confused, she peeked into the corridor, hoping to spot them heading to the restroom. But the train was eerily empty. Every compartment she passed was vacant, the shadows stretching and swaying with the motion of the train. A cold wind rushed through the narrow hallway, though no doors or windows were open. "Strange," she muttered, shivering. Returning to her berth, Vandana decided to turn on the ceiling light, but as she flipped the switch, the light flickered weakly before plunging her back into darkness. That's when she heard it, a faint murmur, like voices whispering just beyond her hearing. At first, she thought it was the sound of the train itself, but the murmurs grew louder, more distinct. They were speaking in a language she couldn't understand, a guttural tone that sent chills down her spine. Gripping her blanket tightly, she peered out into the corridor again, only to find it transformed. The polished metal walls were now corroded and covered in dark streaks. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed violently, casting jagged shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Is anyone there?" Vandana called out, her voice trembling. Her only response was laughter, low, disjointed, and echoing from the far end of the car. A figure stood there, backlit by the flickering lights. It was the old man from her compartment, but something was wrong. His head tilted unnaturally, and his body jerked as if controlled by invisible strings. "Why didn't you help her?" he rasped, his voice dripping with accusation. "What?" Vandana stammered, backing into her berth. "You heard her cries, didn't you? Why didn't you stop it?" His voice grew louder, angrier. Suddenly, the young woman appeared beside him, her pale face streaked with tears. She pointed a trembling finger at Vandana. "You left me to die," she whispered. "You knew." Vandana's mind reeled. She didn't understand what they were talking about. "I don't know you. I don't know anything about this," she cried. The train jerked violently, throwing Vandana onto the floor. When she looked up, she was no longer in her compartment. Instead, she was standing in a small, dimly lit room. A young girl sat on the floor, sobbing. Through a cracked door, a man's shadow loomed. It all came rushing back. Years ago, she had lived in a crowded apartment building. She remembered hearing muffled screams late at night, screams she chose to ignore. She had convinced herself it wasn't her business, that someone else would step in. But days later, the girl was found dead. Vandana had buried the memory deep, choosing to forget rather than confront her guilt. Now, the girl stared up at her, blood pooling around her feet. "You could have saved me," she said, her voice breaking. I couldn't." Vandana sobbed. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do." The girl's eyes darkened, her once youthful face morphing into a skeletal grimace. "Scared? Let me show you fear." The room melted away, and Vandana found herself back on the train. But it wasn't the Nightfall Express anymore. This train was crumbling, its windows shattered, its walls rotting. Passengers filled every seat, their bodies decayed, their eyes lifeless. They stared at her as the train roared through an endless void. She tried to run, but no matter where she went, the train stretched on forever. The whispers grew louder, mocking her, blaming her. "You're one of us now," they chanted in unison. "A passenger of regret. Bound to this train until the end of time." When the Nightfall Express pulled into the station the next morning, the attendants found her compartment empty. Her ticket, now faded and frayed, lay neatly on the seat, her name etched faintly into the leather of the berth. And as the train departed once again, passengers in other compartments whispered about the faint cries they could hear in the wind, and the shadowy figure that sometimes passed by their windows, always alone, always running, but never escaping. The Midnight Rail was an unassuming passenger train known for its odd schedule, always departing at 11:59 p.m. Legends swirled about this line, whispers of disappearing passengers and eerie encounters, but it was cheap and convenient, so Leah paid little attention to the chatter. Leah boarded at the last station of the night, intending to visit her grandmother in a distant town. The train was nearly empty, except for a few scattered passengers, a businessman with tired eyes, a middle-aged woman knitting, and a young boy sitting alone near the window. Her compartment, though well-lit and tidy, carried a faint, unsettling odor, damp and metallic. She brushed it off and took her seat by the window, gazing out at the thick fog curling over the tracks. The train jolted to life, and the rhythmic clatter of wheels filled the air. As the minutes ticked by, the usual hum of an active train began to fade. Leah realized she couldn't hear the conductor's announcements, the shuffling of passengers, or even the steady thrum of the train's engine. Only an unnatural silence accompanied the clattering wheels. She shifted uneasily, the solitude pressing against her. A faint tapping sound broke the quiet. Leah glanced around but saw no one near her compartment. The taps grew louder, more insistent, and she realized they were coming from outside her window. Heart pounding, she leaned closer to the glass and froze. A handprint, fogged and smudged, appeared on the window. Fingers dragged down the glass as if someone, or something, were clinging to the outside of the speeding train. She whipped around to find help, but the aisle behind her was empty. The businessman was gone. The middle-aged woman had disappeared. Even the little boy's seat was eerily vacant, his toys scattered as if he had left in a rush. Leah stumbled into the next car, searching for anyone. It was dimly lit, its air thick and stale, as though it hadn't been entered in years. The windows were fogged, and shapes moved faintly on the other side of the glass, shadowy figures pacing just out of view. At the far end of the car stood a man in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, his back turned to her. Relieved, Leah hurried toward him. "Excuse me. I need help, something's wrong." The conductor turned slowly, and Leah's relief dissolved into dread. His face was pallid, his eyes hollow sockets, and his grin stretched unnaturally wide, splitting the thin skin of his cheeks. His voice was a soft rasp, almost drowned by the creak of the train. "You shouldn't be here," he said, tilting his head unnaturally. "This train doesn't stop for the living." What does that mean?" she stammered, stepping back. The conductor extended a skeletal hand toward her. "You didn't check the ticket, did you? Midnight Rail carries souls, not passengers." Leah clutched at her bag, fumbling for her ticket. When she pulled it out, her blood ran cold. The date was wrong, several years in the past, and the text shimmered like smoke. In bold letters at the bottom, it read, "One way." Suddenly, the train lurched, and Leah stumbled. The conductor disappeared, replaced by a howling wind that swept through the car, carrying with it whispers and anguished cries. Ghostly faces pressed against the windows, their mouths opening in silent screams. The car darkened, leaving her in near pitch blackness. She turned on her phone's flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the heavy shadows. Just ahead, she saw a figure, small and trembling. It was the boy from earlier, clutching a stuffed animal to his chest. "You have to hide," he whispered urgently, his tear-streaked face glowing in the faint light. "Hide from what?" she asked, grabbing his arm. Before he could answer, the train screamed to a halt, the noise deafening. The doors to the car burst open, and a dense, black fog seeped inside, carrying with it chilling whispers. Figures emerged from the fog, their forms twisted and indistinct. One by one, they turned toward Leah, their sunken eyes locked onto her. The little boy screamed and ran, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Leah alone. She bolted for the nearest exit, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. Every door she opened led her back into the same car, the walls and windows closing in. The whispers grew louder, mocking her with fragmented words. "Run, but you won't escape, your stop is coming." Leah tripped and fell, hitting her head against a bench. The last thing she saw before her vision faded was the conductor, leaning over her, his skeletal grin inches from her face. When she woke, it was daylight. The train stood still at a station she didn't recognize, its once imposing structure now weathered and decrepit. The air was bitterly cold, the tracks rusted and overgrown. Leah staggered out, clutching her pounding head. The platform was abandoned, save for an old plaque half hidden in the weeds. It read, "Midnight Rail Memorial Station, 1932 train accident victims." She turned back toward the train, but it was gone, leaving nothing but silence and a faint smell of decay in the air. As she stumbled away from the platform, a crumpled ticket fell from her pocket. It still read, one way. Love these stories? YouTube algorithm suggests that you would like to listen to these stories. Click on the video on the screen.